We all want to burn subcutaneous fat, right? That's the unsightly fat that's, under our skin on top of the muscle. It's what we just really don't want. Well, truth be told, there is a strategy to burning subcutaneous fat properly. We don't want to just go through burning subcutaneous fat without any cognizance whatsoever of visceral fat. And I'll explain this a little bit more, but the idea is burn visceral fat slightly first and then burn subcutaneous fat because it could potentially decrease the, potential for fat to come back. So we'll explain all this. We'll talk about visceral fat a little bit more. We'll talk about subcutaneous fat. Then we'll talk about the specific methodologies that I think you should follow and in what order in order to accomplish, losing that sub-Q fat the safe way. Please do go ahead and hit that red subscribe button, and then please, if you don't mind, hit the bell button and then hit that little tab that says all notifications. That way you never miss our daily videos. Now I'm filming this in my home studio, which is a little bit different because at the time of filming we're on lockdown. So doing this in a private setting. So bear with the different background. Okay, here's what we have to remember. Subcutaneous fat is an energy store predominantly, but it's also padding. Okay, now additionally, it's also a passageway for nerves and vessels between, of course, your skin and your muscle. And then it's also insulative, so it's going to help us insulate. And then it also serves as sort of connective tissue. So it's multi-purpose. Now, overall thing I want you to remember with this video, subcutaneous fat is not bad. It's only bad if you, of course, have too much of it. But it's also only really bad if you have, visceral fat causing a bigger problem. But hear me out on this. So there are some studies that show that obese people that have a lot of subcutaneous fat, that also have a lot of visceral fat, actually do better than people that are lean with low sub-Q fat and high levels of visceral fat. Whoa, what the heck? So someone can be overweight, have a high level of body fat, but be technically healthier than someone that is thin with a high amount of visceral fat? Well, I'll explain it and it all makes sense. It has to do with something called the metabolic sink, which I'll get to in just a second. Now, there's a study that was published in the journal Cardiovascular Diabetology. Now, this took a look at the instance of developing atherosclerosis in diabetic patients. And here's what the breakdown looked like. They found that people that had high sub-Q body fat alongside high visceral fat were actually doing just fine. They didn't have too much of an instance of developing atherosclerosis. Then they took a look at people that had high sub-Q fat, okay, high body fat, with low visceral fat. They were also doing fine. Okay, so visceral fat low, subcutaneous fat high, and still not that big of a development of atherosclerosis. Then, on the contrary, they found that lean people, low sub-Q fat, low body fat, but high visceral fat, actually were in the worst possible situation for developing atherosclerosis. And then, of course, when they looked at low sub-Q and low visceral fat, they were doing just fine. Okay, so when we look at these four scenarios here, which one do you want? Okay, I want to be lean. I want to have low sub-Q because it looks better. But I also want to have low visceral fat because it's going to be less instances of atherosclerosis and less potential inflammatory response. Let's dive in more as to how you'll get there. But first, a little bit more research. So the International Journal of Cardiology took a look at 122 patients. They found that, again, if there was a higher level of sub-Q, they generally had better arteries. Now, they went on to sort of discover, or at least demonstrate, that it had a protective role. The subcutaneous fat had a protective role on the arteries. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, hear me out. Let's dive in a little bit more. Another study took a look at mice where they removed the sub-Q fat altogether, and they found that when they removed the sub-Q fat, they had less glucose tolerance and more insulin resistance. Whoa, record scratch for a second. What does that mean? That means that mice that literally had their body fat removed ended up having less tolerance to carbohydrates, to glucose. They did worse, and they developed more insulin resistance. So fat is helping us? Well, again, only if our visceral fat is high. You see, it comes back to that metabolic sink thing. Now, hear me out. This, again, makes a lot of sense when you really listen to it. We have this thing called the portal theory. Okay, this portal theory talks about how visceral fat releases fat. It releases fatty acids and it releases inflammatory cytokines. It potentially releases toxins, right? Well, subcutaneous fat, the fat on our skin, that is designed to store. So I want you to think about it for a second. If you have a lot of visceral fat, and that visceral fat is dumping out fat and dumping out toxins and inflammatory cytokines, if you have some subcutaneous fat, it acts as that metabolic sink and it can collect it. And when it collects it, it sort of saves you from it. But if you don't have that subcutaneous fat, it's going to go to the liver and it's going to end up affecting you and potentially affecting your arteries and potentially affecting, well, how you feel and your overall metabolism, which is potentially, I say this carefully, potentially why we might have seen that happen with the mice where they developed glucose intolerance and insulin resistance. So at the end of the day, if you lose the subcutaneous fat without losing the visceral fat, you potentially put your metabolism at risk going forward. You put it at risk going forward because you may not realize it, but just by trudging away on a treadmill without changing your diet or just by increasing your exercise, you could be dropping sub-Q fat but not dropping that visceral fat, which might change you cosmetically temporarily, but down the line, it's affecting your metabolic rate and it's affecting how your body metabolizes insulin resistance and glucose tolerance, right? So now you're wondering, what the heck do you do? All right, first things first, and if you know my channel, this probably comes as no surprise to you. Fasting in combination with HIIT. Not one or the other in this particular case, both, okay? The Nature Communications Journal published something really cool. Took a look at this gene, okay? When people fast, there's this upregulation of a gene called MIR149. Now, MIR149 has some downstream processes that actually stop the browning of white fat. So in some ways it's bad, but in the case of what we're talking about, it's good. Okay, what happens is when we're fasting and this MIR149 is upregulated, it triggers visceral fat to become a fuel source. So it actually stops the subcutaneous burning for a little bit, and it drives the burning over to visceral fat. This is great for general health. If someone's not going to exercise and they just want to reduce their visceral fat, 100%, my opinion, is fasting all the way. You see, fasting has larger adipocytes. What that means is you have potentially more energy from your fat there. So it just makes sense from a preferential standpoint that if you're deprived of food, the body's going to want to go to where the energy is the most dense to get you that energy. Fat is already energy dense. Now imagine fat with more energy density. Well, that's your visceral fat for you. So your body wants to burn that. But additionally, our visceral fat has more glucocorticoid receptors. Glucocorticoid receptors are going to be receptors that sense when our cortisol levels are high or when our epinephrine levels or norepinephrine levels are high. That means that when we're in a fasted state, which we do have elevated cortisol and epinephrine in that state, it's going to drive more attention to the visceral fat. So great. Now we've talked about how we can burn the visceral fat, but how do we continue to burn the sub-Q fat? Well, let's talk really quick about insulin first. You see, there was a study that was published in the journal Cell Metabolism. Took a look at two groups, crossover study. Okay, 12 hours of fasting and 12 hours of eating. Okay, and then another group did 18 hours of fasting and 6 hours of eating. And then they had a 7-week period where they washed out and then they crossed. So that means each group tried each study once, or each side once, right? So they did one piece and then they took a break for 7 weeks and then they did the other piece. Well, they found with the 18-hour fast and 6-hour eating group, all but one participant had over a 25% decrease in their postprandial insulin levels, which means that their body needed to produce less insulin to get the job done. That, quite virtually, is the opposite of insulin resistance. So fasting could, I don't want to ever say it reverses anything, but showing in this study, it did the opposite of insulin resistance, right? So therefore, it's making our metabolism better. And that's what we have to look at going forward. But now let's look at the high intensity interval training piece of this whole thing. Okay, so the Journal of Amino Acids published something, took a look at 12 subjects. Okay, now it had them do either a resting kind of control exercise or high intensity interval training in the method of 6 seconds of sprinting, followed by 30 seconds of rest. So they either just did kind of treadmill work, kind of basic aerobics, or they did 6 seconds of sprinting and 30 seconds of rest multiple times. Guess what the results were? Well, 6.5-fold increase in epinephrine at the end of a sprint. Remember, epinephrine releases fatty acids, okay, so it's a good thing. Then there was a 14.5-fold increase in norepinephrine at the end of the sprint. And the best thing is, it ended up increasing with each subsequent sprint. So 6 seconds. Okay, now what does this mean for you? What does this mean for dropping that subcutaneous fat? Okay, remember you're already doing your fasting, which is driving the burning of visceral fat. But now you're shifting to HIIT, where you have more adrenaline receptors in your belly. So the high intensity interval training in a fasted state is going to potentially drive more of that subcutaneous fat to be burned. Now, epinephrine drives a release of free fatty acids from subcutaneous tissue. Let me say that again. Epinephrine, which we're getting a big increase of during this kind of high intensity interval work, draws a big release of energy and fat from sub-Q. So if high intensity interval training is done in a fasted state, then we are getting the benefit, potentially, right? I have to say that, full disclaimer, potentially, because not everyone's the same. We could potentially be getting that benefit of fasting driving the visceral fat burning and the high intensity interval training driving the subcutaneous fat burning, bringing our visceral fat levels and our sub-Q levels down potentially simultaneously, right? Now, that's cool because we don't want to just drop one or the other. We want to drop both. But let's talk some other things that you can do too. Okay, the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition published something that I thought was super interesting. Found that when people increase their protein intake 30%, they generally consume on average 441 calories less per day. Increase that protein. And by the way, if you watch my channel, please, please, please check out ButcherBox down below in the description. Highly, highly recommend. They're a meat delivery service. They are my favorite. And yes, they are a big supporter and a big sponsor of this channel. The best way that you can support this channel and the content that we create is by giving them a shot, but I don't think you'll be disappointed. So grass-fed, grass-finished meat delivered right to your doorstep, in a lot of ways less expensive than many grocery stores, and quite honestly, the quality is second to none. So please do check them out. You'll get a special break if you use the link down below in the description after you watch this video. So you can use them, increase your protein content. I don't care how you do it, but lean, clean, grass-fed, grass-finished meat is what I would recommend. Okay, then another thing that you can do, which is interesting stuff that I saw from another study, drinking 500 milliliters of water may increase metabolism temporarily up to 30%. Now, the reason they're saying this is because it could have a beta adrenergic response, meaning it causes such a stimulation of adrenaline and beta adrenergic activity when you drink a lot of water all at once, that it causes potential fat burning. Basically, you're amping up your adrenaline because your body's like, whoa, what's going on with this water? It doesn't just have to do with the satiation effect. So you might be wondering, should I do my HIIT fasted in a hydrated state? Yes. What I do is I wake up in the morning and I have like literally almost a quart of water. I just pound that stuff. I have some apple cider vinegar, and that's just me. I have a little bit of salt. This is just me again. Sometimes I'll put some cayenne in my water, but if you're going to be doing a hard workout, you might not want to do that. Then I go into my higher intensity workouts, and I do those in a fasted state. I find that it's better that way because it's driving that metabolic just burn that I want. So anyhow, I highly, highly recommend that you check those things out that I talked about. Do your HIIT in a fasted state, and at least you got some education out of this. So as always, I'll see you in the next video, and I'll see you tomorrow. See ya.